Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. It's part 3 of our little series about the ideas behind and around the French Revolution, but today we're not just talking about the French Revolution. I am talking to the historian of ideas Richard Whatmore, who was our guide on an earlier episode to the end of the Enlightenment, about Thomas Paine, who's someone who's come up already a few times in this series. Eric Nelson discussed him in relation to American independence. He came up in our episodes on Sieyès and Robespierre. He is, in some ways, the man who links the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So we're going to be talking about how Paine joins up some of the stories that we've been telling, but also how Paine's story after the French Revolution explains some of the ways in which the wider story ends. Richard, Thomas Paine has already appeared in this series about revolutionary ideas. He came up in our episode with Eric Nelson on 1776 as the author of Common Sense, the pamphlet that lit a fire under the American Revolution. We're going to focus on Paine and France today. But I want to start by asking how he came back, because my understanding of it is that he was born in England. He left in 1774. He went to the New World, as many people have then and since, more or less shaking the dust of the old world off his feet. He was done with all of that. If there was going to be a new order in the world, it would happen an ocean away from tired, corrupt, exhausted Europe. Europe's revolutionary potential had more or less been written off by him, I think. And then, of course, America exploded, and that's his place, right? So when and how did he change his mind about Europe's revolutionary potential? Because, he came back before the French Revolution, so it wasn't, I don't think, that he had his head turned by the fall of the Bastille. He had already started to sense things might be afoot. How and when do we trace the shift?
I think that as a standard Whig, which is pretty much what he was into the 1770s, he shares the view that Britain as a free state is failing, and that the hopes for reform, in a sense, exemplified by the course of the American Revolution. It's proof that Britain as a free state is failing and is likely to fail into the future. But then there's France. And, Paine is one of the American revolutionaries who always comes back to the fact of French involvement and his view that the American Revolution ended up in a European war, obviously including the Dutch Republic and the Spanish, but Paine thought that it was France's involvement that was crucial. And so although, he talks about the New World as the only place where liberty can exist, he's also always positive about France, because he knows that it's French money that has led to the success of the American Revolution. After the Revolution, he's still in contact with Whigs. Obviously, he's become famous because of Common Sense. And he has a kind of second problem in life, if you like, which is he wants to sell his single-span bridge because he thinks he's going to become famous as a natural philosopher. And he realizes there's just not the money in the United States to fund this single-span bridge project. So he goes to France in the early 1780s, and he ends up back in Britain. He goes to Britain because it's where the money is, whereas he thinks he can get investment in the bridge. And a model of the single-span bridge is, in fact, made in the later 1780s. And it is in the 1780s that he comes to the conclusion that reform is still possible in Europe. And he thinks that the Anglo-French axis, which is encouraged by friends of his like the Abbé Morellet, prominent philosophe, the Shelburne Circle that he becomes involved with, and really from 1782, where he writes about the Abbé Raynal's work, basically saying Raynal's too pessimistic, to the prospects on the Rubicon, which is 1787, which is to Shelburne, he really shows that he's part of these Anglo-French, including Franklin and Jefferson, reform-minded figures who think they can establish perpetual peace by getting rid of empire. especially the mercantile system that is the British Empire. And they think if they can do that, then the world as a whole will become more peaceful. And of course, there'll be positive relations between Europe and the United States, and that's good for everybody too. So it really is the fact that there are several Paines, which is no doubt the conclusion that we're going to come to as we continue talking.
When he started to put faith in France because France had been the instrument of the success of the American Revolution, how did he get round the fact of the French monarchy? Did he just park it? Did he assume that it would come out in the wash? Because, as we talked to Eric Nelson about, the thing that he really did lit a fire under in America was republicanism. He'd really nailed his colours to that mast. This French monarchy also symbolised the corruption of old Europe. Where was he on monarchy in the late 1780s?
I think that he becomes more positive about the French in particular. He's associated with second-generation physiocrats like Dupont de Nemours, Condorcet especially. Condorcet, I think, as time passes, is a big influence over Paine. And they think they can have effectively republican reform within the French monarchy as it stands. In a sense, obviously, the French Revolution initially, you blame the old ministers, you blame the aristocrats, you blame the church establishments, you don't blame Louis XVI. So revolution and king together is certainly acceptable until, I guess, flight to Varennes in 1791. And Paine's certainly of that view. He's much more positive about the possibility of reform in France. At the same time, the earlier Whig assaults on George III as the meddler, the person who's preventing, obviously, Whig government by putting his own placeman in prime ministerial positions, that's lessened. Although Paine always has to have somebody to hate, and it becomes William Pitt the Younger. And in a sense, he thinks if Shelburne came to power, again, obviously he's the person who put an end to the war between Britain and France and Spain and the Dutch Republic and the new American republics. If Shelburne comes back to power, I think Paine would absolutely have backed him and thought that it'll be a Republican movement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do radical surgery of getting rid of a monarch. So the possibilities of reform, I think, are strong in the 1780s, and then obviously it goes to hell in the 1790s.
The word revolutionary, it's changed its meaning over time. But from what you say, does it make sense until the French Revolution itself to think that the Paine who comes back to Europe sees the possibility of forms of reform that stop short of what we would call a revolution?
Yes, I think monarchical reform, patriotic reform, republican reform. Paine is somebody who says a republic is a res publica. Governance for the public good, for the good of all, is what he believes in. Later on, Sieyès says he's not really a republican at all because he believes in government by committees, which just means the elected representatives of the people make executive decisions in committees rather than having a single figure who obviously for Sieyès might ultimately be elected. So it's the case that revolution he blames on the institutions that are failing, that he sees to be failing all around him. And it is the case that I think he would have anticipated revolution, especially in Britain. Paine is somebody who would have been shocked by the outbreak of revolution in France rather than Britain. Britain's the more corrupt state. It's near bankruptcy. It has greater economic problems. So I do think it is the case that revolution is something that he thinks ought to happen spontaneously by the uprising of the people and their leaders when the conditions are dire.
So revolution is a function of complete state failure, and France wasn't a completely failed state. As you say, it may sound odd to people who don't know anything about his life. He did think of himself as a bridge builder in the literal sense, not a bridge between America and France, but building things out of metal that could cross rivers. What makes him a celebrity again is the publication of another book, but that book is triggered by a book that comes before it. And so probably to make sense of Paine's impact on arguments around the French Revolution, we have to say something first about that first book, which is Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is the thing that provokes a furious response from Paine. And like you say, he's a good hater, and it's dripping with contempt, his response. Is it possible to sum up the essence of their difference? Difference is probably not a strong enough word for it, but what is it about Burke, who, like Paine, had been a supporter of the American Revolution? What is it about his response in 1790, so very early on, to the events in France, particularly in Paris, the early stages of the French Revolution, that makes Thomas Paine, bridge builder, former celebrity, so angry that he becomes famous again?
Partly, again, it's personal. Burke's attack on Richard Price, who Paine loved, thinks of him as a fellow Republican. And it's Price's sermon that leads to Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France that appears in November 1790. And it's also the case that the vitriol is no question derives from their prior friendship. They're Whigs together. They're both people who've said Britain is failing as a free state. And even though Burke hates Shelburne and some of Paine's friends among the radical Whigs, it's still the case that the two of them could well have seen eye to eye. There are claims that they used to see each other. So there's a personal element. But the essence of the difference is that Burke would say Britain was, is, and remains a free state, whereas Paine is saying it has ceased to be a free state. It's a pariah country. It's been doing evil deeds domestically and internationally for decades and decades. And it's that conclusion, by contrast with the new option, which is suddenly the revolutionary governments of France, that Paine simply thinks straightforwardly are infinitely superior to the old free state of Britain, which obviously he doesn't think is a free state anymore. And it's that contrast, whereas Burke, of course, thinks that the revolutionary state in France is itself a pariah, is itself going to collapse. And obviously he makes a series of predictions that if you get rid of aristocracy, if you get rid of church establishments, and ultimately if you get rid of your monarch, then it's the collapse of the social order. You're going to have disorder. It's likely to be violent. So he predicts the terror. And that's why Burke's seen as a seer in the next few years, especially once terror breaks out. So it's, in a sense, there are liberty wars that have broken out. It's a debate about what form of state is truly a free state. And Burke thinks Britain is a free state. Paine thinks revolutionary France is a free state. And therefore, each comes to the conclusion that the opposite is definitely the antithesis of a free state. And they accuse each other of backing horses that themselves will lead to war and terror.
So the argument about France is, in part at least, a proxy for an argument about Britain. That's maybe what they were really arguing about. And as you say, some of it is personal. Is there also that feeling, certainly on Paine's part, that Burke has sort of turned himself inside out, in the sense that he's now saying that in contrast to France, the things that make Britain a free state are the institutions that he used to think were failing? So he is now defending what we would now call the establishment, or the establishment view, having been a critic of the establishment. And is Paine saying, in part, what is it about what happened over the Channel, which after all is just a separate thing, that means these institutions have completely changed their character for you because they haven't changed? I mean, if anything, they've got worse, because what's happened in France is going to make them even more failed and oppressive.
In a sense, Paine's criticism is fair. Burke does make a turn to the court. He would always say, well, I've always defended primogeniture. I've always defended the landed interest. I've always had a faith in the great oaks. After all, the Whig aristocracy that he served, personified by Rockingham, they are the great oaks that I love, and that he obviously venerates in the Reflections on the Revolution when he's talking about Britain. But there is a defense of court culture, the mercantile system. He's attacking merchant aristocrats who have too much money, Burke, historically. So Paine would have thought he'd suddenly become a hypocrite in that respect. And the veneration, again, church establishments too. Burke, an advocate of Catholic emancipation, a critic often, although he's an Anglican himself, a critic of clerical policy. Then in some ways the critiques were fair enough. But I guess the crunch time had come, to see this big question, the future of Britain question, the condition of England, and Burke's been obsessed with the present discontents. Where are they going to lead us? And I think Burke's come to the conclusion, partly through his links with the new ministers, Pitt and his turn against Charles James Fox, that actually reform is possible in Britain, especially when you see the alternative in France. Whereas for Paine, it's exactly the opposite. He comes to the conclusion, against lots of his former Whig friends, Britain's done for. And actually accelerating the revolution in Britain is vital if you're going to have freedom everywhere, which obviously increasingly is what he wants.
So if Burke is pushed back to defending institutions that he would have once attacked and defending them because they are the traditional bulwark against anarchy or oppression or chaos, is it also the case that Paine is pushed the other way? There are two things going on here. They once had a shared view. These institutions are failing. One of them is now defending these institutions. So the other one has to say, pull them all down. I mean, does it drive Paine into a considerably more radical place?
I think it does. I mean, it's also the case that Paine, he's moving between Britain and France at this time. Like so many people, he visits the revolutionaries. He renews his links with Condorcet, with the Girondins, the so-called moderates, but they're still radical, increasingly Republican revolutionaries. And he sees the people in arms and he thinks it's glorious. He thinks if you free the people, then you can let their naturally good natures act to make them citizens, active citizens. He thinks the British, by contrast, are luxury-loving, lethargic, focusing on the glories of the past. And there's a real cultural contrast. And so it is the case that they have exactly opposite visions, and yet they're so similar in that once you say, okay, the solution to our problems is to get rid of that which you hate. In Burke's case, obviously it's revolutionary France. In Paine's case, it's Britain. And so the transition mechanism to a better world for each of them is getting rid of these so-called free states that each of them thinks are not free states and actually spreading tyranny everywhere. Hence this is a period of liberty wars.
And does it mean that they then completely reconfigure what they thought the other thought about America, in the sense if they were once, broadly speaking, on the same side? Does the fact they end up in totally opposite camps mean for each of them that they can never have been on the same side? And so we now have to have a completely different understanding of the American Revolution too?
I think that is the case because for Burke, the great hope of America was it was going to lead to radical reform, ultimately the return of the Whigs to power. And he thought with that and with the trial of Hastings, obviously Burke's view is always more capacious. He's interested in India as well as America as examples of the failure of the mercantile system. And if you contrast that with Burke in the 90s, where he's so optimistic, in a sense, about the possibility of generating forms of patriotism in Britain that can take on any Republicans. And he's also much, much more negative about Republicans. And hence, he's more pessimistic about what's been happening in the United States as a republic, while at the same time still proud of the fact that he promoted the idea of liberty in the independent colonies and then they're becoming independent. With Paine, actually, ironically, I suppose the irony is that Burke and Paine come to more critical perspectives on what's been happening in the United States post-revolution. And in Paine's case, obviously, especially as he's not there anymore, he's worried that it is also going to hell. And especially with the Federalists, he's an anti-Federalist. He's very, very close to Jefferson. And the more pessimistic that Jefferson is, the more pessimistic Paine is. And they're getting reports really of the failure of Republican reform in the United States, the failure to maintain liberty. Of course, radically, Paine begins to blame Washington after he's imprisoned during the Terror. And that's the emergence of another Paine who even argues that there's been as great a terror in the United States as in France. And actually that the French Republic and the French Constitution of 1795 is the greatest document of liberty. It's the greatest constitutional monument of human wisdom. So you find the new Republic of France to be superior to anything that happened in the United States. So again, he moved to the position that it's the old world that is superior to the new, which for the earlier Paine, obviously that's a very, very shocking thing to say.
Is it almost as though they come to these opposite conclusions because, to sum it up, Burke thinks that the real risk is that America is going to be corrupted by France and the French example, and Paine starts to think the real risk is that America is going to be corrupted by England and the English example. And again, everything then becomes a proxy, including this, this revolution that was once the beacon to the world is now just, it's an ocean away, and it's just an offshoot of what is and has always been the central question, which is the fate of England and France. And who triumphs in that struggle is going to determine the outcome of the American Revolution. So now, as you say, the whole story has moved back to Europe. To take it back a bit from 1795, Paine's response to Burke is a two-part book called The Rights of Man, which is another huge bestseller. I think I'm right in saying, he was a pretty compelling writer, and when he really got going with his pen, he could shift hundreds of thousands of copies of these things. The Rights of Man is a phrase clearly associated with the French Revolution and one of its founding documents. One of the charges that was leveled against Paine was that he was a leveler. So to use a phrase that comes from an earlier revolutionary story, the English Revolution of the mid-17th century, and he was a leveler because we might now say this was radically egalitarian. He wanted to pull down all of the distinctions of rank and hierarchy that Burke has ended up defending. Was he a leveler? Had he moved to a position that we can say this is now genuinely a kind of radical egalitarian revolutionary philosophy?
In a sense, he was, because he embraces this removal of aristocracy. And that's why the contemporary Horace Walpole says, well, you're a monstrous leveler. Of course, Paine's response is the only true mental leveling that occurs is under hereditary monarchy, because that mentally levels everyone, and we'll see the opposite if we genuinely have a Republican revolution. But when you look at places like Ireland, which is just coming back to Burke and Paine's diametrically opposed views, Burke thinks Ireland may suffer a revolutionary contagion. Obviously, he doesn't live long enough to see 1798, the rebellion of the United Irishmen. But Paine's been working for it. He's very close to the United Irishmen from 1792, really from the appearance of Rights of Man, Part 1. And it's the case that this getting rid of corrupt institutions, clerical church establishments, but the aristocracy above all else. Having said that, to say that Paine's a leveler in that sense, that he wants radical reorganization of social structures. At the same time, he always says property is a right given by God, and he is an advocate of property rights, and he thinks that property is the basis of all economic trust and relationships. So he's far away from the 1640s, but he thinks that the greatest French innovation has been the abolition of ranks. And the fact that people can genuinely say, we live as egalitarians in an egalitarian society. He thinks that is the great transformation. And that, the consequences, what's going to happen, are espoused in Rights of Man Part 1 and Part 2. And at that time, 1791, 1792, he's unbelievably optimistic about the future of the world. It's going to be glorious. Once everybody realizes that if you get rid of these corrupt institutions, you set people free, then there'll be this momentum, this cultural force that will rise up, and everybody will be happier without all of these dreadful institutions weighing them down that represent selfishness. Then he has a vision of a new world, and he wants to spread it everywhere. His idea of being citizen of the world, and a citizen of a world which is comprised of sister republics, that vision really articulated in The Rights of Man Part 2 is very powerful. And I think it's Gouverneur Morris who says Paine's big with a litter of revolutions at this time, and the idea he can see them breaking out everywhere, and it's going to be glorious.
To put it in the terms that we discussed last time in relation to Sieyès, the symbol of the hierarchical nature of the French system was the three estates, the first estate, the second estate. These were the clerical and aristocratic orders were the privileges that were got rid of when the Estates General became the National Assembly. Does that mean that Paine was pretty optimistic about the Sieyès version of the revolution? So the attempts to craft a new constitution and the ideas of representation and so on that lay behind that in the case of Sieyès. When he was writing Rights of Man, 1791, the king is still the king. This is still going to be a, broadly speaking, monarchical republic with a monarchical figurehead. Was that enough for Paine? Did he think at that point that this would do the work that was needed, or had he already moved more radically than that? Because what you just described, the kind of euphoric version, sounds a bit more than just the constitutional reordering of the French state. It sounds a bit more like a kind of consciousness-raising exercise, which goes quite a long way beyond Sieyès, I think.
I mean, the French have been speculating about the consequences of getting rid of a corrupt aristocracy, economically and with regard to the church and in politics, for several decades. And I think Paine gets the bug, and he listens to Condorcet and Clavière and Brissot, another prominent Girondin. And for them, Sieyès was always somebody who wrote constitutions and had a vision of new laws. And obviously, as in the case of Sieyès himself, going in the huff when the revolutionaries don't act the way that he wants them to act, and really resigning from involvement in the revolution, which obviously Paine later says he and Sieyès are the only people who survive for a long period of time. In Sieyès' case, it's because he just abandoned the revolutionary scene. But I think there's a sense that Sieyès' version of Republican revolution is a lawyer's revolution. It's getting the laws right. And for the Girondins, and for Paine particularly, as time passes, it's getting the culture right. And unless you have the right culture, then you're not going to have a successful revolution. Obviously, Paine, at the time of the writing of the Rights of Man, thinks what's going on in France is proof that the culture's working and that you've got the rising of the people together and they're going to change the world. So I think that really is the difference. Whereas the counter-accusation to Paine from Sieyès was that he was a lazy so-and-so who he could write beautifully and he could whip up a crowd, but he was never bothered about the legal details. You could never ask Paine to write a law, a proper legal document, whereas obviously, ultimately, Sieyès thought that was his great gift.
The international vision that lies behind this, what's cause and what's effect here? So on the one hand, and this is a familiar story in other revolutionary settings too, so it plays out around the Russian Revolution 100 plus years later. On the one hand, it's a surprise it's broken out in France, in the same way it was a surprise in 1917 that it broke out in Russia. People thought it would come in Germany or Britain or America. So it sort of happens in the wrong place, but fine, we make the best of this. And it's so inspiring that it's going to light a fire under these other places and the revolution will spread. So on the one hand, the hope is that the French Revolution will be the cause and international revolution will be the effect. On the other hand, Paine's understanding of the international order seemed to suggest that for the French Revolution to succeed, it needs to be international. It's almost a precondition. If France gets stuck fighting and defending itself within the terms of the old order, it's first got to take on the old order, then the revolution is going to struggle. The two things almost need to happen at the same time. And that makes it sound a little bit implausible. I mean, I think it's fair to say that France both needs to create an international revolution and it needs an international revolution in order to succeed on its own terms. Is that fair?
I think it is fair, but it also reflects the transition away from the euphoric Paine, because the euphoric Paine thinks Republican patriotism alone will carry the revolution forward. At his most optimistic, which I guess is second part of the Rights of Man and before the terror really kicks in, then he thinks the French don't have to worry about anywhere else. I mean, Paine, at his most euphoric, thinks if people read my work in Britain, there's going to be a revolution there too. and potentially in other places. He talks about the Pole and the Spaniard and the Russian. He thinks if people get access to the ideas that he's espousing, they'll see there's a new world within grasp and it'll be realized. But then it's really the course of the French Revolution, in other words, the failures of the French Revolution, that lead him to the conclusion that something's going wrong. And really the Paine from the Terror onwards, obviously the Girondins, his friends are arrested, in many cases guillotined, or as in Condorcet's case, they kill themselves after being arrested. So he sees a lot of his friends die, but he doesn't blame the French. He thinks it's the British. He thinks that they're trying to destabilize the currency, that they've got spies everywhere, potentially that they're using their money to pay the Prussians and later the Russians and Austrians too to fight the French. They're funding the émigrés to cause as much trouble as possible. So Britain becomes really the state that is responsible for all the ills of the French Revolution. Paine retains a faith in the people. He never abandons it. But the corrupted people, the deluded people, is something that increasingly worries him, but he blames the British. And that's why, to answer your question about the internationalization of the revolution, he comes to the conclusion it's international war alone against Britain by free states. As the French expand their Republican empire, all of these states have to fight Britain and keep fighting Britain, and then the revolution will succeed globally because of the damage that Britain's doing to Republican revolutionaries everywhere and seeking to crush them.
And given that he thought if only people could read my book, they would rise up. And his book was eventually suppressed in Britain, but it was widely read before that. Was it the same story that what had gone wrong in Britain was simply that this corrupt and repressive regime had just got its tentacles into everything and everywhere, and that there was no prospect for the people to rise up because in the end, this thing was a sort of dead hand weighing down on all possibilities of change? Because if his view was these ideas are so powerful, they just need to be heard, it's not as if they weren't heard in the place that he really wanted there to be a revolution. So did this feed that sense that in the end, the tentacles of the British state were everywhere?
Yes. In fact, to the point of extinguishing liberty altogether, there's a book by Vicessimus Knox called The Spirit of Despotism, which is an attack on Pitt's ministry. And obviously the treason trials and the acts against sedition. Paine thought that liberty was crushed to an extent in Britain that was greater than anywhere else. And he thought that that was the fundamental problem. And again, even though, as you say, it's daft because there's lots of Painites, it's not as if people didn't know what's happening in the French Revolution. Paine has this idea that the British people are ready to rise. And you just need to get the circumstances right. Unfortunately, ultimately, his conclusion is circumstances entail an invasion by Bonaparte. And it's only an invasion by Bonaparte that will make the British free. And then the people will rise. And obviously, it was the same expectation in Ireland. The French invasion forces in Ireland, the expectation was the people in Ireland will embrace us as liberators rather than invaders. Of course, it didn't pan out in practice. And of course, the invasion never happens, even though the British are expecting it for the next 10 years, an invasion from France, from revolutionary France. But it never occurs, so it's never tested. But Paine's expectation is that's the only way, because the British state has become a despotism. It is a tyranny. It's supporting tyranny everywhere else, and you have to do something about it. And actually, the French Revolution, spreading the revolution, even if it's by Republican generals who look like Caesar figures, that's fine. But again, it shows the extent to which Paine's euphoria changes to kind of practical strategies, which may entail the invasion of one state by another in the name of liberty.
How did he square that with what I think he had understood about the world that he grew up in, which is that war was the great spoiler of all hopes, that in the end, international conflict is the thing that has to be got out from under. And that was the great hope originally of the American Revolution. They were an ocean away. They could do this without getting sucked in. And now we have an argument which is the only possibility of this revolutionary spirit surviving is to do the thing which is the death of freedom, because the death of freedom is international conflict and everything that motivates international conflict. I mean, it doesn't just look like he's sort of shifted. It does look like he has genuinely turned himself inside out.
I think so. I think it happens to other French revolutionaries. The same thing happens to Brissot. Let's spread liberty everywhere. Let's be crusaders for liberty. And I think Paine also becomes a crusader for liberty. And he really does think war is the transition mechanism to a state of liberty. I mean, ironically, it's also Burke's position. Burke, when it looks as if Pitt's going to agree a peace in 1795 with the revolutionary government of France, then, Burke saying, war, we need to carry on the war, we need to generate British patriotism, we need to fight the French to the point of exterminating their revolutionary ardor, even if it breaks Britain. Burke thought it was so serious. And I think they each, Burke and Paine, saw the other, which each of them is supporting, as the greatest evil. And the irony, again, is these are two self-professed free states. The French think they're free, the British think they're free, but we have to have a war to the death against each other because we think that's the only way each free state can survive. So you get a sense of the fanaticism of free states. They're not trying to challenge despotism in Russia or Prussia or Austro-Hungary or anywhere else across the globe. They're fighting each other as free states. And it's the case that Republican imperialism is on the march, and Paine supports it. Paine's absolutely delighted about the progress of French arms and supports the Directory all the way, is involved in helping plan the invasion force of Britain, designing gunboats that are going to help a successful invasion in the late 90s, always pushing Bonaparte, please invade, please invade, please invade. Because he thinks it has to happen. It has to happen. It's going to be the trigger that finally makes a success of the revolution.
And given he would also once have said the problem with international war is the way it's funded, the funding of these contests on this scale is always going to lead to oppression and tyranny, partly because these are wars of conquest, but also because of the ways in which it's just become so expensive that it props up regimes that have to extract this wealth. Did he really think that the Republican version was just going to be completely different because this was a people's war and so somehow the people would willingly fund it themselves?
Ultimately, for Paine, he thinks that it'll be the war to end all wars.
Right. That old illusion.
Exactly. So once you destroy the British and you experience Republican Revolution in Britain, then the funding system collapses. And that's why in the later 1790s, he writes about the English system of finance, as he calls it, and there's another pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. And they're really predictions that the British are bankrupt. They're finished. They can't fund the war because it's based on the old system, and they're too indebted. The Bank of England's finished as well. And the French economy, by contrast, is much healthier because you've had this explosion of Republican patriotism, and the French can afford it, and all they have to do is carry the war through. So he really does believe, and there's this series of counter predictions for the future of both Britain and France where supporters of each state say, well, the other one is on the verge of collapse. And that really continues actually until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that this tit for tat arguments. But obviously through that period, you experience radical changes, the incorporation of Ireland into the United Kingdom, which is obviously part of the worries about revolution in Ireland. And then, of course, the rise of a Caesar figure in Bonaparte, who then proclaims himself emperor. And even though Paine is actually close to Bonaparte and likes Republican generals, that's the point at which he returns with the Peace of Amiens, when Bonaparte really is in control of everything, and finally has a peace in 1802 with the British. That's the time when Paine can finally return home to the United States. So that's the point at which he's really given up on this view that if the French Republic defeats the British, then we can have perpetual peace.
Another phrase that's associated with Paine, as well as being a citizen of the world, is that this was to be a new age of reason. So he is the champion of reason. And reason in this era is often contrasted with superstition, but also with enthusiasm, with people getting caught up with ideas that have a hold on them in the way that religion has traditionally held people in its grip. And yet, so much of what you describe sounds like a kind of wild enthusiasm, right? This is going to work. Once things get desperate, once you get beyond the early optimism, through the euphoric phase and then the kind of wild phase, the only thing that's going to keep this going is to keep stoking the enthusiasm. This has to be faith, Republican faith. People have to believe in this project. This polity will survive because people believe in it. The British one will collapse under the weight of its debts because in the end, it's a sham. How does he square that? How is the thing that you've just described a manifestation of the age of reason rather than a new age of superstition and enthusiasm?
Paine convinces himself. Paine fundamentally thinks that what he believes is the rule of reason. And at the same time, he accepts that the rising of the French people has led to civil war in France, which ultimately is what the terror was. And although he blames the British, he realizes that you have to have countermeasures, cultural countermeasures to get the French to behave the way they ought to be behaving if they're good Republicans, because spontaneously they're not doing it. And hence the age of reason. I mean, lots of French commentators, those who retain faith in the revolution, they're all writing new schemes of education. The Directory launches all of these projects for education, Republican catechisms, Republican playing cards, obviously the Republican calendar. And the idea is that we're living in a different world. We've got to accept it. And we've got to ourselves create Republican institutions that are going to maintain the Republican culture that we've now realized isn't going to maintain itself simply by the people acknowledging their own liberty. And that's what the Age of Reason is. It's a tract akin to that of the Theophilanthropists. So lots of his friends are writing similar documents, but he thinks that we can have a religion that is reasonable, that'll appeal to everybody, and we're going to get rid of what he calls law religions, which he thinks are clerical and based on church establishments. But at the same time, because he wants to get rid of everything that's contentious, he wants to get rid of revelation, he's critical of the life of Jesus Christ, he wants to get rid of what he calls dead languages. He thinks they're no longer relevant. And of course, he wants to get rid of revelation. So to Christians, this is an assault on their religion. For Paine, it's the basis of a new Republican civil religion, which is going to be the basis of this Republican resurgence and the creation of new kinds of citizens who are going to be dedicated to the country and also a lot happier. And of course, it fails. So it's Paine's attempt to buttress the Republican project, and it destroys his reputation, especially in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this story does not end well. This man he is a unique figure in revolutionary history. His central role in the two great revolutions of the late 18th century, and yet in the terms of both revolutions, he ends up a pariah, doesn't he?
Unquestionably. Again, coming back to something we've already talked about, this sense of the Federalists in power. He hates John Adams. John Adams hates him. And what does he then do? He attacks George Washington. So Paine writes a letter blaming Washington for the fact that he was imprisoned during the terror for 11 months, because he thinks Washington, for some reason, was worried about the progress of the American Revolution in the 1790s and didn't want Paine back because he'd support the anti-federalists. And again, Paine has faith in Paine changing the world.
You'd think he might have noticed during the terror it wasn't just about him, that a lot of people were imprisoned. You don't need a complicated explanation, but it is always about him for Paine, right? I mean, there was something really slightly unhinged about his sense of himself.
Well, also the fact that he's the ultimate individualist. You can't imagine Paine as a member of any club without falling out with all the members, mainly because they wouldn't either venerate him or appreciate his scheme for reforming the club. And the fact that ultimately his politics are about the creation of Republican churches, which in a sense goes back to the boyhood Paine, educated by Quakers. When he finally dies, there's an appeal to have him buried in a Quaker ground, which is refused, of course, because they think he's a monstrous heretic and he's not to be countenanced. So he's peculiar because he's somebody who believes in the people en masse, the people rising up together. And yet he was never somebody who was happy with the together. He's always unhappy about the progress. But then actually, in a sense, to see your own ideas fail and then adjust, and you've got a new idea for solving everything and a new idea for solving everything. So destroy Britain, have a new civil religion. Even his advice to Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, which is one of the things that he recommends because he's still worried about the possibility of the French or the Spanish invading the United States. So he's always got solutions, there's no question, but he's definitely peculiar, even among the list of revolutionaries who are peculiar folk, often, let's face it.
I want to ask you about one aspect of his legacy that it's sometimes his name sometimes comes up in this context, and I want to know whether this is far too much of a stretch. The idea of the rights of man, in Paine's hands, that was a genuinely international idea. He's a citizen of the world. This is about people everywhere, peoples everywhere, the possibility that all of these republics could spring up. This is a world vision, right? And it's a world vision based on a notion of rights. So it's sometimes associated with a 20th century idea, which is human rights, rights of man. So from man to human, we broaden it, but it's only 2 letters. Is there in Paine any earlier nascent version of an idea of human rights, do you think?
I don't think so. No. I think, again, Paine, he's not really interested in women. He's not interested in chattel slavery. He's not interested in Native American peoples. His rights of man, it's more to do with releasing the power of the people to be active Republican citizens. So ultimately, it's about the duties that you expect of people. And like Wollstonecraft, when she's euphoric about the French Revolution, she thinks relations between the genders, they're going to change. They're going to be transformed. Women are no longer going to be women in the old sense. Men are no longer going to be men. And it's the same for Paine. So granting rights, I think, is Paine in the very early stages of the mad/euphoric, great anticipation. You free the people, that's all you need to do. Whereas the later Paine, it's all about how do you get people to behave like good Republicans? Because he comes to the conclusion ultimately that, unfortunately, if you set the people free, they're as likely to turn on each other as they are to create a Republican utopia. And I don't think rights have any role in the transition mechanism, because ultimately I think he lived through a period where rights fail. And it's that conclusion that leads him to these other practical strategies for realizing his Republican vision. And the Republican vision of active citizenship, which is Paine's vision. Everybody is, even from common sense, who does he attack? The sunshine patriot. He doesn't like people who are not going to dedicate their lives to the cause of the revolution and ultimately the cause of the republic, the cause of liberty. That's what he wants. So giving people rights that then don't entail duties, active citizenship, spreading the notion of rights, they're very, very different philosophies, I think. Of course, historically, they are related. You can see why Paine keeps cropping up time after time. Obviously, US presidents, Obama used Paine, Biden uses Paine. You can all draw on Paine's rhetoric, but I think it's a different world.
We're going to do an episode about the Haitian Revolution, and we're going to talk then about the role of slavery in these arguments. But it is striking that a man with Paine's vision, his all-encompassing vision, was really unbothered going back to his involvement in the American Revolution, and indeed his friendship with Jefferson, was relatively unbothered by the existence of chattel slavery. Is it just us 21st century people who find that a hard thing to square, or is there actually something slightly weird going on here, given, it's so easy to take so much of what he says and find in it the things that speak to us, but that makes him feel like he comes from a completely other world.
Yes, I mean, so many of his French revolutionary friends, Brissot and Clavière and Condorcet, they found a society for the abolition of chattel slavery, the Amis des Noirs, and they're missionaries, they're crusaders. They want to get rid of it because they think that slavery is at the basis of an amoral commerce, that it's responsible for mercantile systems. And if the French don't abolish slavery, then they'll create their own version of the mercantile system and they'll replicate the experience of the British economy while claiming that they're different. So it's fundamentally important to them. It's not so much to Paine. I mean, the claim is that Paine's first backers, because you have to remember, partly because he gives all the rights to the work, everything that he writes, he gives it away for free in order to be published in very cheap editions. So Paine never makes any money really from much. Obviously, he's given a farm that's taken from a loyalist for supporting the American Revolution in New York. That's one of the payments that he receives. He's always short of cash. And the claim is actually from the time that he first goes to Pennsylvania, his patrons are supportive of chattel slavery. How far he's always worried about alienating the wrong person and finding himself destitute. I think that is a possibility in the early years. Later on, he's very, very close to Jefferson. And in a sense, I think he thought it's not the battle. It's not the battle for us, because it's not going to determine the future of the revolutions or the republics. And that's where he differs. That's one of the fundamental differences with the Girondins that he's so pally with in Paris.
Is it also the case that, you touched on this earlier in relation to Wollstonecraft, but also Paine, there is a view, once they'd arrived at this all-encompassing vision of the French Revolution, that somehow we get this done and the other problems will fall away. Like, you've got to, in the end, decide which battles you want to fight. And they persuade themselves, Wollstonecraft gets disillusioned faster, I think, but they persuade themselves that if we can win this fight, all the other injustices will melt away. And once you've started on that road, there's no way off it because you've then persuaded yourself that this is the only fight that matters. And it is, it's a feature of many revolutionary situations that in the end, the judgment has to be made. Do we now aggregate all of our problems into this one central struggle, which is the struggle for the revolution itself? And then at some future point, the other stuff will the ground will just shift and everything will open up and we'll be in the promised land. And Paine, I'm not sure he started as one of those kind of revolutionaries, but it does feel like he ended as one of those.
I think that's exactly right. Ironically, he comes across as a kind of a prophet as much as anything else. And it's exactly also the case that he sees crisis everywhere. And that's what he always writes about. He's always writing about crisis, and the states on the verge of collapse. The American Revolution's gone bad. The French Revolution is in trouble. Britain's hell. It's always been hell. It's still hell. You've got to eradicate the hell. And I think that going further than exterminating the immediate fire, to him, it was just, as we said, it's a battle too far. It's just, if you're in crisis circumstances, you don't address something that can then be sorted out once we're post-crisis, where everything gets better. So I don't ever think, I think if you ever said to Paine, are you opponent of the rights of women or chattel slavery? He would say, of course, I'm an egalitarian. I want the abolition of slavery, but he thinks they're second order problems. Whereas if you're living in the crisis of the revolution and the revolution and getting the republic right is going to change the world, then they are not issues you need to deal with directly.
And so then if you're Paine, you die a man disappointed on all fronts.
You certainly do. The death's sad. Obviously, nobody comes to the funeral. 6 people. He's castigated. He is close to Jefferson. Jefferson maintains a correspondence with him. I think he expected the call, that he was going to be called on again because of his experiences. It never happens. He drinks too much. And ultimately, they're happy when Cobbett steals his bones because they think, his neighbours think, oh, well, the bones of a heretic have gone. The ground was probably cursed. It's a good thing that he's been taken back to the old world. So the fact of the afterlife of his corpse is actually welcomed in the United States because they think he's such an abominable figure, an enemy of Christianity and ultimately an enemy of the American Republic. And again, it's so ironic given the way he perceived himself.
We're going to be broadening out this series now, broadening it out from Europe, broadening it out from the famous political revolutions, to talk about a whole range of different revolutionary ideas, settings, and contexts. Next time, I'm going to be talking to the historian Hank Gonzalez about the Haitian Revolution. Coming up, we've also got episodes on the Taiping Revolution in China. We're going to be talking about Darwin. We're going to be talking about the Bayesian Revolution in statistics. We're going to be talking to Chris Clark about 1848 European revolutions that spread their impact all around the world. This history of revolutionary ideas is going to go global. Do join us for all of that next time it's Haiti. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.